Sunday. First up, we have Tim Penhey deploying a Django application using Juju. Tim is a Kiwi who currently works for Canonical on the Juju project, and he's been using Python for around 13 years. He's been involved with pretty much most of the Kiwi PyCon conferences, either as a speaker or organizer. So looking forward to seeing what you're going to show us today. Please welcome Tim.
Right, I think this is switched on. Hello, people. So I thought of another potential title for this, which was how I actually used Juju to deploy my Django application up to EC2. So this talk is not a Django talk. It is not a talk about the internals of Juju or how it works, and there is not a lot of Python code in it. Bit of backstory, Rachel had this really cool idea. Rachel's my wife, and she has had many, many business ideas and tried to get me involved with them. And a lot of them have been rather complicated, and I've gone, I don't know. I can't implement that. That sounds like it needs a lot of buy-in from lots of people. But this particular one, I was like, hey, an idea that I know how to do. I was like, okay, we can do this. So we actually started a company. We're in the early stages of beta, of trying something out. We're not going to go too much into it, except it's written in Python. So we've got what I thought was a minimal viable product. It's like, okay, now I need to make it available to other people, not just off my laptop. So it is a Django app, Postgres backend, jQuery using Backbone for the front, and we've got a phone gap for the mobile side. Pretty much technologies were chosen because it was what I was comfortable with, and what I found first on the internet that looked like it worked with Backbone. So as a traditional developer, I followed the Django tutorials. I chose Django not because I was familiar with it as such, but in the past I'd used Pyramid, I used Zope, and I wanted to use something that actually had a big community behind it. So I decided to choose Django. And so pretty much everything I used from Django was based from their documentation. I followed all the examples. So yeah, this is how I ran stuff, right? You use run server, and then I found this neat plugin that allowed me to have run server plus, and that's just how I did things. But now I had to make this available to other people, and it wasn't going to run it on my local server. That was an option, but I did not want to do that. I wanted to make sure this site was alive. I need to worry about backups and security and scalability and stuff like that. So this was mentioned at the start. I wasn't sure if it was going to be mentioned or not, but I do work on the Juju project. And Juju is written in Go. That's why I'm not talking about it in detail here. But effectively, Juju is all about service orchestration for the cloud. It's about deploying stuff up into public or private clouds and managing things at an orchestration level around services. So the idea of when we deploy things, what you're deploying are charms. And charms are the idea of encapsulating best practice of how you deploy software in a way that it then can interact with other charms using interfaces. So when you're writing a charm, you describe an interface that says, say this is a good one here would be a database connection. So Postgres has an interface that will talk to Django, and Django has an interface that will talk to Postgres. And when you relate the two, Postgres goes, oh, you want a database? I'll create you a database and a user and a password and hand those back over the relationship to Django. Django can then use those to talk to the database. So the idea is to have more loosely coupled components that can work together in many ways. So the really question is, why did I decide to use Juju? I am not an ops person. I'm a developer, and I do not know that much about managing servers. So I thought, well, the whole idea of Juju was to try and encapsulate best practice of how you deploy software by the people that actually deploy production software. For example, I know the guy that wrote the Postgres charm is our DBA at Canonical for deploying our production Postgres, and I know he knows how to do that really well. So I was like, I'm going to use all his stuff that he wrote. So there were existing charms for what I wanted to use. There was a Postgres charm. Someone had written one for deploying Django, and someone had written something for gunicorn, which I read somewhere on the internet, which was a good way to use Django in production. So I thought, right, I'm going to start with those. The other benefit is it allowed me to test my cloud deployments locally. Using Juju, I could just test locally on my laptop using LXC containers as if they were cloud instances. I could then test all of the interactions, the relationships, make sure they worked, and then, in theory, you can just push that out into a public cloud and it'll all work. And I knew it could help me with scaling later. I mean, right now, when we're in the early beta test phase with one or two real users, we don't need to worry about too much about scaling. I don't have to worry about database replication. I don't have to worry about memcache because pretty much there's no real load on the servers. But I know should one day this becomes a real thing and it scales, then these are concerns that ops people really have to care about. I would need to horizontally scale out the app servers. We want to put HA proxy in the front of it, master-slave databases at the back end, whatever we need to do. And I know that Juju will help me with that later. I wanted to have simple, repeatable deployments, just like building code these days has become, people are now accepting that building code has to be repeatable. Now we're dealing in ops, you need to be able to repeatably deploy your software into a production environment. And I know that Juju could help me with that. So I was like, okay, it has some good things. However, the project we're working on, being a startup, is all closed source, and the charm that was made available, its default assumption was you had open source code available on GitHub and it would just download and use it. And I'm like, okay, I'm not going to do that. So I needed to do something else. So Juju has this concept of a subordinate charm, which is a charm which operates with the main charm. So the main charm I was using was the Postgres Django charm, which was here's how you deploy Django. What I needed to provide it with was our actual application. So the way to do that was to write another charm that would work in relation to it, and it would then put my app code into the right place, in the right directories on the server, and it would work. So what we had to do is we had to create hooks. Hooks inside the charms are effectively get called when things change. So this is the Juju management orchestration process. So when your charm gets deployed first on the machine, it'll call an install hook. When any config settings get changed, it'll call config changed and upgrading the charm. And also the relationships when I connect to Django or not. So as a subordinate charm, what the Django charm tells me is, here is the install directory that I've put. Here's where the settings directory is. Here's where your URLs directory is. And mostly here's the thing to call manage.py in order to set things up. They're just scripts. Juju's language agnostic. As long as the thing is executable, it'll call it. I use Python because I kind of like Python. There is a Python charm helpers library which helps you write charms with Python, which is quite cool. So this was very much an interesting experience for me because I'd been on the Juju team for over a year writing the code that was going to be deploying my software, but it was a completely different experience as a user. So it was interesting. So in reality, the only hooks I really had to worry about, I effectively deal with two hooks. I've got the install hooks, which basically installs my dependencies, and everything else hook, which basically ran when the config changed or the relationships got changed. So one was install my dependencies, and the other one was make sure all of the code and everything's up to date. Now, this is the only Python slide here. This was new to me. This is actually what settings.py looks like for the Django charm. And as most people are aware, settings for Django is just a module, so you can do things. And I looked at this and thought, what is it doing? So effectively, it has a directory full of files, which it just reads and executes, hoping blindly that they're not going to kill you. But this was different to how I'd set up my default application, which was following the tutorials, and it was just a big config file. So what I needed to do was to break up, the first thing I had to do was to break up my settings.py file. So the charm has, when you initially deploy the charm, it'll create these first 3 files, and when it loads them in, you saw that it sorted them, so it'll actually load them in order. So we have the simple thing of here's your application secret. It has some allowed host stuff with debug flag, whether you set that or not, and a whole pile of extra config settings that you can set as general config parameters passed into the Django charm. Now, when you connect the Django charm to a Postgres charm, it will write out this extra file here, which is the Postgres engine connection for the database settings. So when that handshaking goes on, when they get connected, Postgres says, here's your database, your user, and your password. The Django charm writes that down to a file and effectively will restart to make sure it reloads all of that information. So you then have your access to your database. So I thought, okay, I'm going to break mine up. I think I went slightly overboard, but once I started splitting them up, I'm like, well, I'll keep them real separate. It's like I'll keep nice little small files that are very definitive. So what I had my charm do is anything that finished in -Juju was automatically copied across when I deployed the charm, and everything else was just my local deployment version of things. So I've got my database settings where I set the debug and other access for the root URLs, which the Django charm does for itself, but I needed to have my code operate both standalone, because I'm still running it with /manage run server, and so that still needed to work, but I also wanted the same code to deploy remotely. So I had to break it up. So the main ones there were, the application was called Kawaw. I was using Django all-auth, that was pretty cool, and some email settings to send stuff out. I also had to break up urls.py. It had a very similar pattern for importing a lot of different URLs. Because the Django charm itself is written in such a way that it can have multiple applications installed. I was only using it with one, so I just had to work in with that. So did all those changes, fire up the first deployment. This was still locally at this stage. Loading pictures. No, didn't work. It went error, improperly configured. But this is my first time deploying it with non-debug settings. So it's like, okay, debug switched off. I'll turn it back on. So try again. And nope. So I was using the debug toolbar because I found out it's a kind of a nifty little utility. Showed me all sorts of nice things about the page. But there are certain things that manage.py does by magic that I never knew. And so this just did not work for when I was running it through a different whiskey engine like gunicorn. So I had to go and, again, Google it. So how do I manually register this thing? And it told me, so I went and changed it. Third deployment, nope. This time it was all-auth wasn't configured. And then it's like, oh yeah, now I remember. One of the things about all-auth is that you actually need records in a database for each of the plugins that you have, and it needs to be configured right at the start because that's just how they did it. I think there was a bug outstanding somewhere that will make it all configurable from a config file, but they're not there yet. So it's like, okay, off to the admin interface. And I had no images, no CSS. I'm like, what's going on? And then it's like, oh, static files aren't served by default if you use the non-whiskey thing, because another magic thing that your manage.py thing does for you. So I thought, well, the two options were, well, I could just enable it, but then I'm like, no, that's wrong. I'm trying to do a real deployment. I should do it the way ops people suggest. Again, Google, what am I supposed to use? nginx. It's like, okay, that's easy. Probably easier than Apache, which is what I was used to. So I thought, okay, let's go look at nginx. I was hoping there would be an nginx charm that I could just plug in, but no. There was someone was working on one, but it hadn't been promoted, so that means that it was not yet approved by this group that say this is the official one you should be using. So I thought, right. I needed it to work on the same machine that I was doing everything on. I knew I wanted to go SSL. I knew I was going to have to deliver my cert somehow to it. I thought, right, I could either write another charm or, you know what, this is simpler. I'm just going to shove it in my existing charm and make my existing charm do not just deploy my app, but also configure nginx. Because nginx is actually really quite easy to set up. If you've ever played with Apache, nginx will be a doddle. The one thing I found is I needed to run this extra thing here called collect static to grab all of the static files that any of your apps use, stick them in one directory so it can be served by nginx without touching the app server. Because you do not want to serve the whole point of doing this was to serve them directly off disk and avoid hitting Python at all. Right, it's like, oh my God. Oh, I felt so excited. What I'm not telling you is the amount of time that went between the first and the fourth. And I think one of the things that I found particularly frustrating as a Juju core developer is that if I did not know the benefits that it was going to give me later, I would have thrown it out weeks ago. Now, this is valuable information for me to take back to the team, but it didn't leave me feeling with this great thing inside. So what I had is, so this is the makefile I used to make my charm. So it's inside the build tree. I was using a virtual env on my laptop because that's what you do when you're doing Python stuff. But the Python Django charm didn't use virtual envs. So it was installing things like the database driver and the time zone stuff directly from system packages. And if you tried to do it with pip at the same time, it complained bitterly. Not so much that it wouldn't work, but it just gave me lots of output I didn't really want to see. So again, I go through the requirements file, strip out PyTZ and psycopg. I copy my entire app across into the payload, make sure I take across my SSL and the SSL keys, and then make sure I remove all of the fixtures. You do not want to have accidental fixtures being loaded in. Upgrading my code in Django was really easy because once I go into the payload or into my charm directory and I say make update payload, to deploy the code, that's the line of code I run. I just say upgrade charm kawaw, and it just sends that, uploads it to the server. The server then runs the upgrade hook, followed by the config change hook. That would then install the packages, copy everything across, and then it would trigger the reload inside the Django charm, which would then cause the reload in the gunicorn, which would just reload everything, and it's magic. It was cool. So there were a few takeaways from this. One is documentation is not great. And it wasn't so much, the interesting thing for me is it wasn't the documentation around Juju itself. Juju was fine. The problem was the charms I was using. When you're using, this is someone else's software, this is how we're going to be deploying the code, I found that there wasn't sufficient documentation around what it was doing or how it was going to be working for me to make enough use of it. Luckily, all charms are just code, and I could go and read the code, and it was written in Python, and it was using Ansible. But on the whole, I could read it and see what it was doing. And then I was like, well, now I need to write a payload charm to deliver my application. How am I going to do that? I knew the theory. I knew it could be done. I didn't know what I needed to do. And again, that involved reading the code, which is not ideal if you're a new person coming to a tool and going, this is what I want to do. It's also interesting from an ops point of view. If you're an ops, I know that the ops guys we have, they're not going to use some random charm that some other guy said was good. They do all of their own internal audits. They read all of the code. They make sure they know what it's doing, and make sure it's not doing anything stupid. But that's their job. They manage that. But I guess I wasn't expecting to do that as a simpler user. But in the end, I had to. But I'm not sure if we should have to. It's an interesting point. The other thing is that Python Django and gunicorn were great. They work together. The charms were written by the same guys. But it wasn't useful in itself. Because when I first tried to use it, it goes, well, you've got no static files. In order to do static files, you have to do something else. That something else is handled by someone else who hasn't done it yet. So that was not overly useful to me. I thought, and I brought up and proposed to these guys that what we should have is a nice full-stack Django charm, so you don't need to have Django and gunicorn and nginx all separate. We could say, well, this is a simple one. Let's just have it so it supports everything. We might be able to turn bits off, but let's have one that just does everything. It would be nice if you could have a config setting. You say, here's my SSL set. It goes, oh, you want SSL, in which case I know I need to change this Python setting, this thing inside the nginx. I need to modify this other thing to make sure the cookies are available over HTTPS. All of these things, they're little things. There's about 3 or 4 things you need to do. They're all simple, but it's the sort of thing a charm could do automatically for you, and I think it would be very nice if it did. And the answer from the guys were like, great, you're going to write that for us? And I'm like, in my copious spare time, no. Well, I thought it would be nice, and I thought it would be one of those nice Friday afternoon things you could do. I still yet to have a Friday afternoon free where I could actually devote it to something other than panic. So from our point of view, from our app, the Postgres is still currently storing its database on the ephemeral image. So I fired everything up on an M3 medium with a 20 gig root disk and said, go, and it works. And the Postgres charm is really great. It'll take daily backups. I've not tried any, so they're obviously broken. So I would like to be able to get to a stage where I can try and restore them. I want to make sure that I want to be able to bring up a staging instance and say, okay, bring me up a copy of this. I went for a wildcard SSL cert so I can create a staging or a dev copy of my thing, get a copy of the production database, bring it all up. And theoretically, in theory, it should be relatively easy to do. Especially if we can end up mounting, have the underlying database and the backups on different storage that can then be mounted into the other instances, so I can restore directly from effectively a local disk. And again, it's all theory. I think it'll work, should work. So here's the Juju commands I used to actually deploy the thing. So I had to, since I was using some local charms and some real charms, the Postgres charm was available in Trusty. Things I only wanted to deploy onto one machine because I'm cheap, and an M3 medium is going to cost me about $56 a month. So I wanted the machine to be Trusty. Postgres works inside Trusty, which is why it's got the CS Trusty as the charm store. I was being very explicit in what I wanted. The Django charm was only available in Precise, but I knew it worked on Trusty, so I basically fork it locally and then deploy it as if it's local. Again, I had to do the same thing with gunicorn. So I deploy those three charms, add the relationship from Django to the database, and one from Django to gunicorn. I deploy my local charm, add the relationship from that to Django, and then I expose my app. So my app, or my charm basically is the one that deployed nginx. Nginx opens up port 80 and 443. So if you come in on HTTP, it'll just redirect you to HTTPS. But by default, all the ports are closed. So anything you want to make available, you have to expose through the charm. The charm makes a call to say, open port 80, open port 443, which gets recorded. So when you expose it, the firewall rules are updated on the cloud, and that is exposed. And that's all it is to deploy it. And that's very similar to how it's similar to how I deployed it locally on my LXC containers, except I didn't have to worry about deploying it to the same machine. So the only thing that was different was I had some of the prod config was a wee bit different, and I didn't deploy it to machine 0, which is the bootstrap machine that get brought up. And that was it. And it sort of worked, which is good. No. Well, I would love to, but the projector doesn't like my laptop, so I had to copy it across in the last minute.
Do we have any questions?
This sounds a lot like something that, to quote from Octopussy, is not quite perfected yet. Do you think you've kind of learned a bit about actually using Juju that's going to help you make it easier to do that kind of thing? Because, I mean, it sounds great, but you kind of put me off wanting to look at it.
Damn. The interesting thing was, Juju was not the thing that failed me. And it was all around the charms and the software that I was using. To make a benefit, I had no issues with gunicorn. I had no issues with Postgres. They all came up fine and do what they needed to do. The only frustrating bit was how Django was working. I think one of the key benefits I took away from it that I've been taking back to the team was that we need better documentation around the charms. That we say, and for some of them there is great documentation, but particularly, I mean, Django is an interesting type of charm because it's not I'm deploying a database or I'm deploying WordPress. Those type of things are relatively simple. Django is a framework charm, right? It needs other things in order to work properly. It's a similar way that the Rails charm this is how we deploy Rails or the Node.js, but they're effectively things you use to deploy the real workload. And the real workload is your own app, whether it be Ruby or Node or Django. So I think the key thing I took back to the ecosystems guys was we need much better documentation around all the framework charms if we want to get people that are writing code in the frameworks to use this to deploy things into production. As far as other things that are going on, there are some benefits and workflows around charm development process that we already know were pain points that we're trying to improve on. But yeah, I think the biggest thing was the framework charm documentation issue. But it is worth looking at, particularly if you're using it if you've got your own deploy scripts that you've already got to deploy your stuff into production already. There's not a lot you need to do to convert that into a charm and then have Juju deploy that into other clouds for you. Because most ops people have a lot of scripts that do all this anyway. No one does it by hand anymore. Everyone's going to automate it. So the whole benefit of this is to have controlled automation where you can link in with other things.
I have one question about somehow like giving examples how to use Juju, because it sounds that, for example, if you would have the content of this presentation on Juju website as kind of like the way, okay, this is how we can deploy a whole package, then I think users will be happy with using it. So just kind of like showing, okay, here I can use this way I can go with Django. For example, if I need something else, just to have a whole package. So maybe just this kind of set of tutorials, and it would be quite good.
I'll take that up with the guys. We have a whole team around the ecosystem that work in the documentation and getting people involved with it. When this is online, I'll point them at it, and they can decide how crazy they think this is. But yeah, I do have a good relationship with those guys, and have expressed that we need more tutorials of this type of thing. But yeah, I think it would be beneficial.
Because I think this presentation, even because it shows kind of like a pains you were going through, would be really good as a tutorial.
I do think some of the pain points I hit was just being a Django developer as opposed to someone that has ever deployed Django inside a real environment or a real ops thing. I'm sure anyone that's deployed Django in ops would have hit a lot of these things before, and they would have known not to do stupid things like that I was doing.
Unfortunately, that's all we have time for today. If you have any more questions, I'm sure Tim would be happy to answer them later today. Otherwise, please join me in thanking Tim.
Thank you.